Imagine you're the only animal on Earth that knows it's going to die. Not just knows, but thinks about it, turns it over, writes poetry about it, builds religions around it. You can't stop. Now imagine that awareness didn't make you wise, that it made you, constitutionally, unavoidably, unable to be okay. A Norwegian philosopher named Peter Wessel Zapffe thought about this problem for most of his adult life. He concluded that human consciousness is a biological mistake, a tragic overreach of evolution, and that the most honest response, the most ethical response, was for humanity to stop having children and quietly walk off the stage of history. His most famous essay is called The Last Messiah. It was published in 1933. Almost no one read it. That's the thing about ideas that are too honest. They don't get popular, they get rediscovered. Peter Wessel Zapffe was born in 1899 in Tromsø, Norway, a city above the Arctic Circle where the sun disappears for 2 months a year. That detail feels almost too on the nose, but here we are. He was a philosopher, a mountaineer, a playwright, a photographer, and by all accounts, a hilariously funny man at dinner parties. He lived to be 84. He apparently found this ironic. He studied law and then philosophy, and he spent his career in the tradition of what you might call pessimist philosophy, a lineage that runs from Schopenhauer through Nietzsche's shadow to Zapffe, and then onward to thinkers we'll get to in a minute. But here's what makes Zapffe unusual even in that tradition. He wasn't performatively miserable. He wasn't an ascetic or a recluse. He loved climbing mountains. He had a long marriage. He made jokes. The darkness in his philosophy came not from personal suffering, but from a kind of clear-eyed biological analysis. He looked at what consciousness actually is, what it costs to have a brain this big, and he didn't like what he found. Zapfe's central idea is simple and brutal. Human beings are biologically over-equipped for the world we live in. Every other animal has a level of consciousness that is just sufficient for survival. We have consciousness that vastly exceeds what survival requires. We can think about our own thinking. We can anticipate our own deaths decades in advance. We can grasp the indifference of the universe to our existence. We can imagine every possible way things could go wrong. This is not a feature. According to Zapffe, this is a fatal error, an evolutionary overshoot, the biological equivalent of a weapon that turns on its owner. And the proof, he argued, is that humans have had to develop an entire suite of psychological defense mechanisms just to get out of bed in the morning. This is where Zapfe's philosophy gets genuinely useful, and really unsettling, because the more you look, the more you see it everywhere. He identified 4 strategies humans use to suppress cosmic awareness. He called them anchors, things we latch onto so we don't drown in the void. The first, isolation, the simple act of refusing to think about the big questions. You push the thoughts down, you change the subject, we stay busy. Most people spend most of their lives doing this, and it works fine, until 3 a.m. when the brain gets quiet and the thoughts come back anyway. The second is anchoring, attaching yourself to something, a religion, a nationality, a career, a relationship, a sports team, and allowing that thing to give your life enough meaning that the larger meaninglessness stays at a manageable distance. Zapffe wasn't dismissive of this. He understood why it works. He just thought it was, at root, a chosen illusion. The third is distraction, the deliberate flooding of consciousness with stimulation. Keep the brain full, keep the calendar full. Never let there be enough silence for the real questions to surface. Zapffe wrote about this in 1933. He did not have a smartphone. Imagine what he'd make of us now. The fourth is sublimation, channeling the terror into art, philosophy, religion, or any other creative or intellectual work. This is the strategy Zapffe himself used, which he acknowledged with full irony. He wrote a philosophy about the impossibility of being okay, and in doing so, he was sort of okay. The abyss becomes material. The horror becomes craft. What's so striking about this framework is that it's not really pessimistic in the hand-wringing sense. It's almost diagnostic. He's not saying you're wrong to anchor or distract or isolate. He's saying, notice that you are. Notice that we have to. Notice that the whole project of human civilization might be, at its foundation, a collective agreement to not look directly at the thing. The essay that Zapffe is most remembered for, the one that carries the seed of everything we've been talking about, is The Last Messiah, published when he was 34 years old. The title refers to a figure who arrives at the end of human history not to save humanity, but to finally tell it the truth. And the truth, in Zapfe's telling, is this: know yourselves, be infertile, and let the earth be silent after ye. That's the conclusion. Not revolution, not transcendence, essentially voluntary extinction. Not because life is worthless, but because consciousness at this level of intensity is a burden no being should have to inherit from its parents without consent. This is the part where people either close the browser tab or get really interested. There's almost no middle ground. It's worth being precise about what Zapffe was and wasn't saying. He was not advocating for murder, for suicide, for despair as a way of life. He was making a philosophical argument about reproduction, specifically that bringing new conscious beings into existence, beings who will suffer and die and be aware of both, is a form of harm that we've normalized because the alternative is extinction, and extinction feels unthinkable. He thought it was, in fact, thinkable. He thought we just refused to think it. Now here's the part that should really grab your attention if it hasn't already. Zapffe didn't start a movement. His essay was read by a small philosophical audience in Norway. He went on climbing mountains and writing plays and making jokes at dinner parties. He died in 1990. The mainstream never found him. And then, in different countries, at different times, other thinkers arrived at almost exactly the same place. Thomas Ligotti is an American horror writer, one of the great ones if you like that genre, who in 2010 published a nonfiction book called The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. It's essentially Zapfe's argument re-arrived at independently, dressed in literary theory and existential horror. Ligotti didn't find Zapffe and decide to continue his work. He found himself, through a life spent with severe anxiety and illness, arriving at the same conclusions. Consciousness is malignantly useless, he wrote. The horror genre, he argued, is the only honest art form because it's the only one that doesn't pretend the world is okay. If Zapffe is the philosopher's version of this idea, Ligotti is the poet's version. Then there's David Benatar, South African philosopher, University of Cape Town, author of Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, published in 2006. Benatar makes the argument with academic rigor that Zapffe made with literary flair. His core asymmetry argument goes like this: the absence of pain is good, even if there's no one around to enjoy that absence. But the absence of pleasure is only bad if there's actually someone being deprived of it. Therefore, bringing a new person into existence who will inevitably experience pain is, on net, a harm, and the only guaranteed way to prevent it is not to create that person in the first place. This argument has been called monstrous, logically irrefutable, and therefore monstrous. It has generated an enormous amount of philosophical literature in response, most of which amounts to, I know this is wrong, but I can't quite prove why. And then there's the internet. The Anti-Natalism subreddit has hundreds of thousands of members. There are philosophical anti-natalism communities, voluntary human extinction communities, communities specifically built around Benatar, around Ligotti, around the broader question of whether existence is worth inflicting on another being. Most of its members have never heard of Zapffe. Most of them arrived the same way he did, alone, at night, thinking too clearly about something most people have learned not to think about. So here's the real question. Not whether Zapffe is right. That's a question for philosophy class and comment sections. The real question is, why does this idea keep getting independently discovered? Zapffe in 1933, Benatar in 2006, Ligotti in 2010, and hundreds of thousands of people in online forums arriving at the same harbor by different routes. One answer is obvious. The conditions that produce this kind of thinking are getting more common, not less. Urbanization, atomization, the erosion of traditional meaning structures, access to information about suffering at a global scale, the climate crisis creating a specific new flavor of dread about the future. All of this makes Zapfe's four anchors less stable than they used to be. The distractions are louder, but the silences are louder too. But I think there's another answer, and it's one that makes Zapffe specifically worth understanding. His framework doesn't require us to agree with his conclusion to find it useful. We don't have to believe humanity should go extinct to benefit from asking, what am I using to anchor myself? What am I distracting myself from? What would I see if I stopped? Most philosophical traditions tell you that asking those questions is the beginning of wisdom. Zapffe would say it's the beginning of a problem that has no good solution, and that the wisdom, such as it is, lies in choosing your coping mechanism honestly, with full awareness of what it is. He chose sublimation. He chose art and philosophy and writing The Last Messiah at 34, and then going back to climbing mountains. There's something almost funny about that. The man who concluded that consciousness is a fatal design flaw spent the rest of his long life using that consciousness to look at mountains and write jokes. Maybe that's the most human response of all. Peter Wessel Zapffe died in 1990 at 84, which is either ironic or irrelevant depending on how you look at it. He never became famous in his own lifetime, not even in Norway. His philosophy was too cold and too clear and too willing to follow its own logic to wherever it went, no matter how uncomfortable. Those are not qualities that generate bestsellers. But ideas don't die just because no one reads them. They wait. They get rediscovered by people who came to the same dark room by a different door. If you've ever had the 3 a.m. thoughts, the one about the size of the universe and the brevity of everything and the specific silence that follows, then you've been in the same room Zapffe was in when he wrote The Last Messiah. He just refused to turn the light back on. Whether that's courage or despair is, I think, one of the most interesting questions in the philosophy.